Have you ever struggled to find the words when somebody asks you the question, what is your purpose? Hey there, I'm Danielle Zapchenk, and I am so thankful you are joining me today on the Parable Podcast. Please meet my guest, author and business strategist, Danita Cummins. She shares about having trust in God when we are not fully seeing what is up ahead.
And if we can strive to live in the promises every day, then there is an opportunity for us to then lead from the promise. And what does that look like for your teams and your organizations and your families? Because you are no longer living in a scarcity mindset. We're no longer living in this place. We are living in the promises of God, and we're leading people through them.
Here's my conversation with Danita Cummins. Welcome back to the Parable Podcast. I am thrilled to introduce you to someone I've never met before, but I'm thrilled to introduce you to Danita Cummins. Danita, we connected through the internet, and so here we are, just getting to know each other. Welcome to the Parable Podcast.
Oh my gosh, thank you. It is so great that you let me come on, like I said, and share space with you, your podcast space. So yeah, I'm super excited. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm a note taker. I told you that before we started, and you were just sharing a couple pieces about you. And I'm like, I need to know more. Okay. Number one, you said you live on a farm and you guys have to figure out trash. As for somebody who lives in the suburbs of Chicago, like I don't even really think like we just have to get it out on Monday. Please tell me, one, how did you get to farm life? And what does garbage look like for you?
Oh my gosh, this is so fun. This is the best question to start a story with. Okay. You're like trash management. So I'm originally from Oklahoma. My husband is originally from Indiana. I did have a small farm growing up. So we had, horses and cows, and we baled hay, and my dad worked in the oil field, and my grandparents are both farmers. Both my grandfathers are farmers. So we kind of come from that background, but we both joined the military. We traveled all over the world. I moved 26 times before we got to the farm, not including my own deployments and things when I was an active duty Air Force in the service, and then also as a Department of Army civilian. And so we finally kind of made roots in North Carolina. So that's where we are now. My husband had always wanted land. And I didn't really care, where we lived. And I think because we had just moved around so much, I'd never really attached to like a place, really, a home or whatever, and never really saw that as something that was super important to me. A safe place for sure, but not really a specific home with land and things. But he always had this dream since the time he was little that he would have a place. And he has 8 brothers. So he's a baby of 9 boys. And so he grew up with a big family, and he loves families. And so he always wanted a place where people could come home to. So I say that God intervened in a very powerful way. So it was like Jesus and a really great algorithm where we found this place, and it was about 2 hours from where we lived, and it's inside the Uwharrie National Forest, and it was a home that popped up on Zillow one night, and we thought, well, let's just go look. Let's just go see what it is. And we came out here, and we were in a really hard season. We have 4 kids, and at the time we had 3 of them still at home, and Mark had been deployed 9 times. So for about 10 years, he had been gone. And I remember walking out here, and he and my son just took off walking out in the woods like they had lived here their whole life. Like they knew exactly where they were going, And my daughter walked up to the pond that's at the end of the house, and she sat down. And I just had this moment in my heart where I was like, my grandbabies are going to run around that tree. Like, we're not going anywhere. And so I looked at the realtor and I said, so do we like put in an offer, or like, we didn't have an agent or anything. And he was like, I mean, I guess we can. And so we moved to the farm. We just kind of threw everything in the truck, sold our other house, and moved out here into the middle of the woods, literally. And got out here and realized there's no trash service and there's no internet. There's no, we do have, obviously water and power, but it was just this huge transition. So as we were sharing before, like it's all the things that you don't really think of. Our like suburban lawnmower died the first year it was out here because they're just not made, they're made for small yards. They're not made for a woodland whatever. So it's been a learning experience as we've come out to the farm, and we're like, oh, this is why people, do this. You have to kind of be a professional here. But anyway, it's been really good. We love it.
Yeah. I love that when you walked out and you were just there for the first time, that you had that vision of God's like, this is your space. I think that's so beautiful. And just like how God like moves us into these like new spaces and new areas, especially when you said that you were deployed in multiple areas. You moved 20, did you say 26 or 29?
26.
26 times. So now creating this space is lovely. Did you and your husband meet while you were both serving in the military?
We did. Mm-hmm.
Was it love at first sight, or was it like, oh, I don't know about you?
No, we both were previously married.
Okay.
And we actually, we were at Andrews Air Force Base on 9/11. So we actually, I was working that day on 9/11. And so that's a whole nother story.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So we didn't, he tells stories, which is kind of funny. He says the first day he saw me walk into, the workspace, he thought that I was beautiful, but then he realized I was 8 months pregnant and was like, that's clearly,
you were still beautiful,
yes,
just
it was
taken.
super. He says that now, and it was just as beautiful. I won't say beautiful. It was a very hard, I say that to people and not say it in a dismissive way. Like divorce is the worst and hardest thing. I've never lost a child, but I've been through divorce and I lost a parent, and it's just as devastating. Right. So on all the levels of places. So I don't say that loosely, but it was, we built a lot of things, you have to unwrap a lot of parts of your heart and pain and hurt and grief and things. So God has been very good to us.
Danita, you have a lot of roles in your life besides garbage manager. Can you tell us a little bit about those and what you're really passionate about?
Sure. I will say I've worked for 30 years. This year is 30 years. I worked for the Department of Defense, both being, in the military and serving as a defense contractor and then as a Department of Army civilian. So I do have this great heart and passion for helping people who can't help themselves. Right. And I think years ago when we came to Fort Bragg, when we came down here to the Special Operations Command in North Carolina, and I started to really see what it's like, I just had this heart to realize that in some people, God calls us to be, preachers and teachers. And I truly believe that in others, God calls warriors. And that's just a calling. And so that's kind of a theme that I've seen throughout my life as a protector and a person who's just really passionate to stand up for justice and to help people who can't, help themselves. So that's translated now. I've been serving in bivocational ministry for 14 years. So I have a pregnancy resource center that we started in 2018 called the Alpha Life Pregnancy Center through my own experiences with unplanned pregnancy and different things. So I serve in that space as a director, and we work in a crisis, outreach center. So we help women and families who are trying to find help or, make a pregnancy decision or adoption or struggling with miscarriage or infant loss or post-abortion recovery. So again, as very much the same theme, my heart of just helping people, standing in the gap for someone, who's lost or hurting. And then when I left the military service through a bunch of different experiences, lost my job during COVID, like a lot of us kind of went through, I started a consulting business. So now my time is spent half at the pregnancy center doing life. And then I serve as a consultant business strategist. So I really work with small to medium-sized businesses and nonprofits who are trying to grow their organization and help them with organizational design, strategy, and then leadership development, like all the parts inside our organization that make it tick, that we don't often understand why things are doing the things that they're doing.
Danita, on the military front, was that something that was ground into you because of previous family members have been a part of the military? What was that journey like for you?
So I think my dad and my grandfather were both in the Air Force and the Army Air Corps, which ended up being the Air Force. My grandfather served just for 4 years. I'll say just for 4 years, So I didn't come from a big military family per se. And after high school, I had no plan for college. No one in my family other than my father had ever even graduated from high school. So I was the only other person to ever graduate. So college just wasn't something that our family did. We were very much like, work in the oil field, work in the farm. College isn't something that we do. So it was very much a kind of an intervention moment where my boss, I was working at a restaurant and he was in the Navy as a reservist, a pilot. And he came to me one day and when I was a high school senior, he said, what are you going to do for college? And I said, well, I probably won't go to college. Like, that's not what we do. I'm not going to do that. And he said, well, have you considered ROTC scholarships in the military? And I was like, nope, don't even know what you're talking about. So he said, well, and this was in the 90s, right? Where everything was on paper. And so he's like, well, I'll get the applications for you and I'll bring them to work and I'll help you fill them out if that's what you want to do. And I was like, sure, I don't know what you're talking about, but it sounds like, sure, why not? I'll try it, And he asked me this question, which I laugh now at my 18-year-old self, but he said, well, do you want to apply for the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or the Marine Corps? Like, what do you want to apply for? I said, probably the Air Force and the Navy because I don't want to wear green. And he was like, okay, And that's why I tell people, like, that's how I got in the Air Force. I applied for ROTC scholarship because I didn't want to wear green, and ended up wearing green my entire Air Force career because that's what our uniform was, and didn't get the ROTC scholarship. And then at the time I was waiting for the selection notification. An Air Force recruiter called and said, hey, would you be interested in joining the Air Force? And I said, I actually am. I'm awaiting for an award notice. And so I went in and saw him, and same thing, had no idea what I was doing, and signed up. And on my 18th birthday, he came to my house. I was still a senior in high school, and I signed my own enlistment papers. And then I found out I didn't get the award notice. So my whole rest of my senior year, I just knew that I was going to go into the Air Force and do something. Yeah. So graduated from high school and spent the summer at home working. And then October of 95, I jumped on a plane and flew away. Yeah.
And how long were you in the military?
I was active duty for 8.5 years. And then I was in the Air Force Reserves for a year. And then I was a defense contractor for about 8 years, off and on. And then I spent 6 years as a Department of Army civilian. So I went back into the civil service as a Department of Army civilian, and then had enough time that I could take deferred retirement. So I took deferred retirement from the Army in 2020.
Thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you so much.
So now, knowing that you chose the Air Force, what would be something that you could tell your 19, your 18-year-old self? Like, what, after you've experienced all of that and you have ended your service, you'd be like, hey, I wish I could have gone back and told you this.
Man, I think I'm in this season of my life because I just turned 48 in December. And I am just now at the place in my life where I'm trusting my voice and trusting, obviously, that God is who he says he is, that his promises are true, that they are for me. But if there is anything that I could go back in all the years, because it was like the first time she joined the military, the first time she became a new mom, the first time she, almost lost her house in foreclosure, the first time she deployed, all the things. I mean, that would be the thing I think that I would go back and tell her over and over and over again. Trust that he is good. Trust your voice. Trust your heart. Trust that you have the right things that you need today, and unapologetically. Right now at this place, I'm in this season of my life where I'm all about taking back what the enemy stole from generational sin, from my family, from people in my life, from myself, like the lies that the enemy has stolen. So I'm just like ruthlessly unapologetic about who we are in him, who God is, what his word says, what his promises are. And I wish I could have just whispered that to her soul,
Ruthlessly unapologetic. That could be the next book, Danita.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you're recording this.
All right. Well, before we jump into your parable story, I feel like there needs to be like this fun fact that we need to hear about, because it brought me great joy. There was a part in your book that just came out about your superpower. I think many girls would want to do this as well. What was your superpower?
That I would secretly become a mermaid. That's my superpower. Yeah. Time travel would be really cool too. But secretly, I would really love to be a mermaid. I'm really holding out. I'm just waiting for one day I'm going to wake up and be singing and have a tail fin.
I think that's because, at least I am 42. I always forget my age. But Ariel, that was like the first Disney movie that I saw. I'm just like, this is fantastic. And our daughter is 15. She loved mermaids. Even when she was growing up, she had like a mermaid tail, like that she wore in the pool. There's like fancy ones you can get out. People I see, you can like train your lungs to be able to go underwater for a while. Some of those fun things, like when we think about heaven someday, I'm like, I think it's going to happen.
Maybe we can. That's so good. I didn't even think about that. Look, I'm going to have like a whole new journal segment now about, I have these questions about what heaven will be like for sure all the time, where I'm kind of like, is this what heaven is going to be like? What is heaven going to be like? That would be a beautiful thing, wouldn't it? Like
that would be. It would
how
be.
Free that would be.
All right. Well, the whole point of the Parable podcast is letting people know that their story matters. And I think we have all these moments and times, all these stories, like even everything that you just said, like that create these concepts and these ideas of like, oh yeah, like God's been walking alongside of me through this part when I was 19 and signing those ROTC papers, is on the farm of like hearing those whispers of what God is doing in my life and building the space for my family. So Danita, I'd love for you to share with us one of your parable stories today.
I think the one that comes to mind that when I try to look back, like you said, how can I sum up all these years? And I go back to this a lot. Even today, actually, it's an interesting because I was having a conversation with a colleague today and with my husband. But it's the story of the Israelites in Exodus 13 where they're wandering through the wilderness and they're following a cloud. And it just blows my mind because like we go back to the simplicity of it. Like I'm from Oklahoma, right? I've seen stores and they come up, in storms and they just like, before you know it, like there's a massive storm cloud in front of you and it goes away. And so I always think about that story. And I have spent so much of probably the last few years of my life and my leadership journey really in this space of like, what was it like to follow the cloud every day? Like what color was it? Like, was it gray or white or black, right? Like these very tactical questions that we have sometimes when you read the scriptures and you're like, was there a cloud watcher? Did he like call it? And he was like the person that was his job to tell people when it moved, because the scripture tells us, right, that it was a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so A.W. Tozer does a great job. He has a wonderful book where you can read it, where he talks about that and the faith and the trust and the unknowing of you don't know where the cloud is going. You don't know where God is moving. You don't really know. And all you can do is follow the cloud. But the beautiful lesson for me that I've learned and I still learn is that that's all God asked me to do. God did not ask me to move the cloud. He did not ask me to hold it. He didn't ask me to plan it. I didn't build it, right? I'm responsible to follow the cloud and to keep my eyes on him and to see where he is going. And so I think for me, if there was one lesson that I continue to go back to all the time in seasons of unknown or seasons of confusion or doubt or whatever, or purpose, which is a lot what the book is about, this concept of purpose, is going back to just trusting that he is good and that, just follow the cloud. So I say that in a lot in ministry as we've built a ministry over the years. For example, like I would say to people, like, we're just following the cloud. Yeah. I don't know. So my job is to wake up today, see where the cloud is, follow the cloud, rest when the cloud tells me to rest.
That's so good. Danita, I was just having a conversation with a friend. She was asking me to share a devotional for a group that we're gathering for this weekend. And I think that this is so helpful because we were talking about like how people have these expectations of their life, or we control things, or we think, and then even on your website today, you posed the question of like, what happens when life disrupts your carefully crafted plans? Right. And that happens more often than not. And just having this concept of like, when that happens, to just follow the cloud. But that can be really hard. That can be really challenging. Can you talk to me about a time in your life where it was really hard to follow the cloud, or that transition of like finally figuring that out for yourself?
I think there are a lot of seasons in my life and big things, like big global things, right? Like 9/11 and deployments and unplanned pregnancy and all of these, they're really big, hard things, divorce. And, when my dad passed away, I have a really good friend who passed away last summer from stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. And we walked through that with her for 5 years. She was 30 when she was diagnosed, 32. And like, there are so many moments, I think, in my life now, fortunately, I can look back and say, these were really hard moments and they shake you and your faith. And I think where I sit today in this place is like deep down inside, I think all of us, whether we know it or not, we're asking this question, like we need a truth that we can anchor ourselves in that never ends. And so we know that, I think, from a faith-based perspective, like as Christians, like I know that God is good. I know the gospel says Jesus is the source of all truth, right? That everything in God's purpose is found in Christ alone. We know that at topical level, like in our mind, but then there's this truth of like knowing, like in your soul, like, like it grounds and centers you and gives you that peace that whatever is happening tomorrow, you're still going to trust in that. And so for me, the transition has come from me, and I've done the same thing, like you're saying this, like, what is my purpose, right? So that was really the impetus of the book, is this question that we're all asking ourselves, what is my purpose? But then we put purpose into so many titles or so many roles or so many things. And then I would watch through my own life, those roles ended. Like I could have said my purpose was to be a warrior. That's what I could have answered that question to you when you asked, but I'm not a warrior. Yeah. I don't wear a uniform. And so that role ended. But who I am as a person, a woman of faith, and as a protector, that didn't end, or I could have said my role was to be a wife. Well, then that marriage ended. And I didn't have that role anymore. Or heaven forbid, I have really good friends and they've lost children, right? Yeah. And we can believe in families are eternal because that's what the scripture says, that God creates all family in heaven before he creates them on earth in Ephesians. But there are so many moments in my life where I have seen this like, oh, my purpose is this. And then it ends or it unravels. So I got to the place where I started to ask the questions just for my own personal selfish nature of like, Lord, is there another focus? Like, am I supposed to be chasing after purpose? Like, what is the purpose? What's my purpose? Or should I rest in something else? And it really came to the place where I truly believe my job as a Christian is to rest in God's promises. Like it's his purpose. And he owns it and controls it like the cloud. But my role is to rest in his promises. And he's given those to me freely, right? There are thousands of promises that God has given us. And so that has radically changed my entire perspective about purpose, about faith, about trusting in God, about belief that he is good, right? That he is for me, that his promises are for me. The provision will be there. The love is there. The grace is there. The wisdom is all the things that he promises in his word. And it has radically shifted, my perspective of being able to then see something in front of me and be like, I don't really understand what's happening, Lord, but I know that you're good. I know your promises are for me, and I am going to go after those with all that I have.
I love that you said it's a radical shift because it is a complete mind change. I remember in college, The Purpose-Driven Life, it came out.
Yes.
I mean, our whole church did it. I think every church in America did that book. And so, we can become ingrained in this idea of purpose or roles. I've known a couple people who've been retired recently, and like that, it completely like boggles their mind because they're like, oh, this was my role. This was my purpose for X amount of years. And so, to have that radical shift is beautiful, but it's also that hard change. If you were able to kind of just share a couple like tips of like how we can navigate that, how can we kind of continue to implement that in our life, what would be some of your suggestions?
So I had these same conversations as we were writing the book, and I had an amazing book coach, and she'd come to me every month. She was like, I don't know. How are you going to get there? Show me how you're going to get me to the end goal. I hear what you're saying, but I don't see it. And so there are, from my perspective, there are like 3 stages to it. And this is really how the framework of the book is built. So the first piece is understanding the psychology and the theology of what purpose is. So there is an academic part of like, how do you define purpose? If you ask a person, what does purpose mean to you? We all have different answers. It's meaning or destiny or calling or purpose, but those aren't actually the same thing. And so purpose has a very specific definition. It's a goal that's personally meaningful and has impact beyond yourself, right? So if you were to take your life, Danielle, you would be like, what is your purpose? Your one sole purpose in life? Other than being maybe a woman of faith, whatever that role is for you to share God's love with the world and do those things, it's very difficult for us to just quantify one goal. I've had 100 goals. I want to be a mermaid. I want to scuba dive the Great Barrier Reef. I want to go to outer space and travel to outer space. But that's not my purpose. Those are just things I've done. And so when I start to shift my perspective, I start to see that, maybe my purpose is not in this one thing. So that's the first part. And then understanding that in the scriptures, when we quote these verses, Romans 8:28 or any of the other ones where we talk about purpose, Jeremiah 29:11, it always comes back to the promise, or it always comes back to God's purpose. It's God's purpose found in Christ Jesus. And that for me was phenomenal because then I started to see God's purpose is in Jesus always. And we know that, but what does that look like in my daily life? Right? So that's the first kind of part. And then there is a psychology of purpose anxiety. There's a lot of writing on it. There's a lot of academic research about that anxiety that it causes us, the doubt and overwhelm and insecurity. And I don't know that we really define it as anxiety, but in 2014, Larissa Rainey did, kind of coin the phrase purpose anxiety. And that for me was very freeing because now I have language around how I'm feeling. And it lets me see that it's not just, in my mind. So the first part is that. The second part is that we put purpose in so many things. We put it in our identity, in our performance. We put it in our pain, which is a really big one, right? We always say in the church, like if there's a purpose in the pain, then it will matter. Or if I can use this to help someone else, then that must be why God brought me through this thing. And there's truth to that, I think, in terms of helping someone else, right? Offering your pain. But it is more important, I think, for us to see the Father's heart always. And then the third part of that, so once you've worked through those pieces, which I'm not saying is easy, those are big things, right? So that was kind of, how do we break this down into guideposts where people can kind of walk down their own purpose road, stop along the way. There's a workbook section at the end of each part of the book that for that reason to help you kind of unwrap, okay, what do I think now? And then the third part of that is like, what are the promises of God? Like I didn't know before I started the study for the book. I'd never studied the promises of God. And they're everywhere. They're everywhere. There are thousands of them. I think in the research, it was like different people have opinions, but there are over 8,000 promises that God has given us in his word. And so for me, that's just phenomenal to be like, the promises are everywhere and I miss them. That's kind of the three parts of it, is like acknowledging that there is way more going on under the surface than we really understand. And then really getting clear on what the definition of purpose is. Like, how do we really, and then we can quantify it and measure it. Yeah. And then what are those idols of purpose? I say in the book, like the idol of purpose. How did it get upside down? Because sometimes I think, to your point, it does.
Yeah.
And we don't mean it to. There's nothing wrong, because we all want to be good stewards at the end of our days. We want to know that our time, talents, and treasures mattered. We do. And that's good. But how does it flip upside down?
I love that. I love that you said acknowledging the promises of God, because sometimes we don't see them. I think that's so huge, of just like understanding and being more attuned to how God is moving in and out of our life. And also as we're reading the Bible, as we're experiencing God within community and prayer, you're right. I think like that idea of idol of the purpose gets forefront. And I think that's easy for people who are Christians, because you're like, but we're doing the work of God and we're missing out on those pieces. Share with me a little bit about that idea of like having purpose as an idol, because I think for some of us to be like, wait, what do you mean by that? Like, I thought this was a good thing.
Right.
Your thoughts on that?
I think that for me, I go back to the place in the Bible, like God called us to two things. And this really culminated in a youth group. We were working youth group studies, but it was more so I could see it with a 15-year-old freshman and a single mom at the pregnancy center. And one of the women who's in my Bible study group, who's doing small group with me, and my 93-year-old grandmother. And they're all saying the same thing, right? What is my purpose? What is my purpose? And I was like, the gospel has to be true for everyone, or it's not true for anyone. So the gospel has to be true for, a single mom with 4 kids, or a woman who's handicapped, who is like, it has to be true, right? We believe that the gospel is the truth. So what is the truth of those places? So that, I think, is part of it, is just really having that peace, knowing that we're all asking the same question. So there's great grace. So I went back to the place where I was like, but God did not tell us to find a purpose, like a hidden Easter egg hunt. Like and we're all guilty of it, but it's like, we're chasing it. So then the idol of purpose is like, that's what I'm focused on. I'm focused on where's my purpose. And if I can find my purpose hidden in the world somewhere, then I will have arrived at some place that God told me to, but it's a mystical mystery and I'm supposed to figure it out my whole life. Like that's not how God works, right? God is not a God of confusion. So that was really the beginning part of trying to unwrap the idol of it and how it looked on the outside, right? Like looks in reverse. So then the alternative was, well, God called us to love him with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We learned that first in the Shema and Deuteronomy, and then we find it again in Jesus' teaching, right? So we have the same message, love me with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so it's like, you're going to spend your whole life loving God. You will, because every single moment you're going to pick something up and put it down. You're going to grieve. You're going to lament. You're going to hurt. You're going to have joy. Like that's a lifelong journey. And then you can love your neighbor as yourself in a billion different ways every single day. There's someone in front of you every single day. And so if we're super hyper focused on purpose, it's almost that analogy where someone is standing in front of you today suffering and they need something. And you're like, well, I know, but I've got to find my purpose first. I'll come back and let you know when I'm done. I was like, what are we doing? I think that's at a big level, the idol of purpose. That's how I see it gets upside down. Because I have a heart for suffering of people. So, and then, like I said, the second part, how does that manifest itself? It really does come down to, I think, a lot in our identity of Christ, because that's where the enemy attacks us the most, is our identity. And so we have to know that our identity is found in Christ Jesus. And that's a whole unwrapping depending upon your history and where you've been and things that have happened to you and what the enemy has allied to you. There's the performance piece of it, when purpose becomes performance, because again, I'm guilty of it as well. Like when I have a coveted badge around my neck and I have a title, right? Then there's, I find my identity in that. And in our pain, we kind of wear that on the outside, or a badge of, whatever. So I think those are the big 3 pieces where I see purpose, the idol of purpose, and not by intention, like you said, not malice intent ever. Yeah.
I love the direction of how you've created this thought process and this framework of this book. Again, Danita's book is Promise Over Purpose. As we wrap up, I would just be interested to know, this is literally like a child being born. When you birth out this book into the world, I mean, you spend so much time and effort and thought process going through what this book is supposed to mean. And as you're writing this for faith-driven leaders, what is ultimately your hope for them as they're writing that? You don't necessarily know where they're encountering this in their life and in their faith journey, but what would be your hope?
I think when I originally started, it was to just ease the anxiety for the person who doesn't maybe get to say out loud that they are really struggling with this thing called purpose, and to give them a place to just lay that down for a minute and be like, it's okay. You're not alone. These questions have been asked since probably the beginning of time.
Yeah.
And so that's the first part. But as I've grown through it and the discovery journey of writing the book, I say that now, like on this side of it, like if all I ever got was the lessons that God taught me and to be able to see his promises every day, that's so good. But what I live in now is just helping people to understand that I believe our purpose is to let all of God live through all of us. And that's a lifelong journey. And we can find true peace, which I think is what the world is so looking for, is just the peace of living in God's promises every day. And if we can strive to live in the promises every day as leaders, and as people and as Christians, then there is an opportunity for us to then lead from the promise. And what does that look like for your teams and your organizations and your families? Because you are no longer living in a scarcity mindset. We're no longer living in this place. We are living in the promises of God, and we're leading people through them, which very much, if we go back to the Israelites and Moses and what he was called to do. There was uncertainty and doubt and fear, but they lived in the promises of God every single day. And that's really my hope, is that for faith-driven leaders, of course, but for anyone who's struggling to just find a place where it's safe, where they can lay down their purpose questions. And then tools for them to be able to recognize and live in the promises every day, to start to lay some of that anxiety down, and then hopefully find a way for them to, like, lead others.
Well, this is such a thought-provoking episode. I'm so glad we connected, Danita, because I really think that this is so encouraging. And also, like you said, just like to ease the anxiety, whether you believe yourself is a leader or not. And I do believe everybody is a leader in some way. There is such promise over your life, and just like focusing on that and following the cloud is always going to point us in the right direction. So thank you so much for your time. If people wanted to get connected to you or grab Promise Over Purpose, how can they do that?
So they can totally just go to promiseoverpurpose.com, and the URL will direct them to the book website. It's on Audible, which is super exciting. I wrote the music that you hear in the intro and stuff. Lovely. So I'm super proud of that. And then my website is danitacummins.com. So they can find all of the details about extra pieces on there.
We'll have everything in the show notes. Danita has a podcast as well. You can listen to us back to back. Boom.
That's right. That's right. Boom, boom.
Oh, well, thank you, Danita, so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you very much. It was very much a blessing.
Wasn't that an enlightening conversation? I know for some of us who are struggling with purpose, maybe we idolize it, or frankly, we just need the reminder of God's promises. I really appreciate Danita's perspective. To connect with her, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. If this episode really made an impact on you, would you consider subscribing or liking, whatever it's called on your platform that you're listening to the Parable Podcast, and maybe even writing a review, or better yet, maybe you know someone that could be encouraged by what Danita said today, and pass this episode along to them. Here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Danita. Number 1, how can you follow the cloud today? Just like Danita shared about the story of the Old Testament, how the Israelites are following the cloud, what is your one next step? How can you continually follow that cloud of God in your life today? Number 2, to ease your anxiety, if you are in this seasonal shift, there's some changes going on in your life, or you feel stuck, what is one promise of God that you can hold on to today? This episode was edited by my husband, Eric Zapchenk, and we hope you were encouraged to think about your own parable story. Remember, your parable showcases how God wants you to focus on the cloud and his continued promises. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.